Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of CNC Basecamp. You know, when friends and family come over to the house, the meal's done, everyone ends up congregating at the kitchen table. It's nice to have kind of a game to play, keep the conversation going. Well, one game that I really enjoy is dominoes. It's pretty easy to learn. The kids can handle it, and it's fast-paced. Well, today on Basecamp, we're going to make a domino set. It's a fantastic project. If you have a small machine, no problem, it'll fit. So today, we're going to make some beautiful dominoes with some V carving, show you a couple different ways to handle the numbers, make a box for it. When you're done, you're going to have a beautiful set of dominoes. You can gloat a little bit to the in-laws, and you can beat them at the game. So stick around. To create the files for this project, I used V-carve exclusively. So let me show you how it was done. Here I have a board about 5 by 16 inches, and with 28 different tiles, that's a lot of little tiles to draw individually. So instead what I did was to create a master domino with every dot in there. And so bringing that in, let me go ahead and rotate that. And after rotating it, I went ahead and used the rectangular array tool and put a little bit of distance between it and the other dominoes. And I'm going to go ahead and I used 2 rows and 4 columns. And had an offset of 0.75 inches between them. So let me go ahead and center that in our material. There we go. There we go. So you can see I've got now 8 dominoes, and they have all the spots on them. And so what was simplest to do with 28 of these is simply to go through and delete all the unwanted spots. And so that made it pretty simple rather than having to lay out all these different individual dominoes, just to start with 1 and then to go through and delete until I had all 28. And so this is actually the first 8 dominoes that are going to be cut. So there's 4 sheets. 3 of them have 8 dominoes, as you see here, and the last one only has 4. And so I'm going through all the different variations of blank, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, including the doubles. One thing you'll notice here is I have a circle drawn on either end of the board, and we're going to use that as a guide in order to flip the blank over. So I'm going to be drilling that out and into the spoil board, and that's going to be a reference point to allow me to flip the workpiece over. Because we're actually going to begin by cutting the V-carved pattern on the face of the domino first. It's just a little bit easier because of the bit changes to do that first. And that's what we're up to. Here I'm in Ready to Carve Basic, which is the operating program for a next wave machine. And so once we have carved all these little decorative V-carves, we're going to flip the part over, and we're going to be using registration holes to make sure that we're holding correctly to the registration of each individual piece. We'll cut the vertical slot here, then we'll move to cutting each of the little numbered indentations. We'll finish by cutting the profile of each individual domino. So let's go to our CNC and let's begin V-carving the flower pattern on the back of our first set of 8 dominoes. Well, it's time to cut the flower pattern, as you see here. I've got a piece of maple on my CNC, and you can use any wood you like, but I would suggest you use a very dense hardwood. The domino will have a little better feel if it has a little more weight to it. Now I'm making my dominoes 5/16 of an inch thick. You can make them a little thicker if you'd like to, once again to increase that weight and give them a little heft. I'm using a 60-degree V-carve bit. As you can see here, I've got my pattern displayed on Ready to Control Basic, which is the operating system that I'm using for this next wave machine. And I think we're ready to go. The next step in making our dominoes is to cut registration holes. And that registration holes will be a 1/4 inch hole here and here. And the hole is going to be drilled not only through our blank for the dominoes, but it's going to go into the spoil board itself. That's going to allow me to accurately flip the part over and re-register and be in the right spot for our next series of cuts. I have changed the bit. I've taken out the 60-degree V-carving bit we were using, and I've put in an upcut 1/4 inch bit. And that's a good bit for a drilling operation like we're going to be doing now. Okay. So I've got my blank flipped over, and for registration pins, I just grabbed some router bits since those were handy. Now our part's perfectly registered, and we're ready to begin. I'm going to go ahead and change out this 1/4 inch bit and put in a 1/16 inch tapered bit, and that bit is going to cut those division lines to separate the two halves of the domino. So let me change out the bit, we'll re-zero and get that cut. Well, it's time to go ahead and cut the little dots for each of our dominoes. So I've put in the machine a tapered 1/8 inch ball nose bit. And the reason I'm using that is I want kind of a soft impression rather than a hard edge drilled hole. And that taper plus the ball nose gives me that. So we're all set up. Let's go ahead and cut the dots. This will be for the first 8 dominoes. Of course, there are 3 other sheets after this to complete the full set of 28. Well, it's time to go ahead and cut out the individual dominoes from the parent stock. I've changed bits. I have a 1/8 inch 2-flute upcut bit, which is just the right bit for cutting through this maple. So I think we're all set up and ready to go. Let's go ahead and cut out the perimeter of each of these dominoes. Well, once you get all your dominoes cut out on the CNC machine, it's going to be time to separate them from the motherboard. And these I've just separated using a simple chisel and a mallet. And then I'll take it over to a little piece of sandpaper and sand off the tabs. All right, with the tabs taken care of, our next step is going to be to go to the router, and we're going to put a slight fillet along all these edges. And so I've got a little mini router table here, and I have a small solid pilot 1/16 inch radius bit. You want a pretty small bit, no larger than an 8. So let's go ahead and route that. With the edges relieved, we can use a little hand sandpaper, but this is a good time to employ a little bit of power sanding to smooth the edges and get everything nice and flowing. A couple options you might already have in your shop are some little flap wheels like this, or here's a Merit Sandiflex, or I'm going to use a larger wheel on a separate machine. And with those you can sand all the edges, blend those, and also hit the faces while you're at it. All right, with our dominoes routed, sanded, we are ready to think about what to do with these little indentations for the numbers. You have a couple of options. Now, take a look here. This one is just plain, and we use that ball nose bit. It looks good. Depending on the wood, when the oil or the varnish hits it, remember it's going to darken those down and they'll start to pop. A couple other options, take a look at this. I cut small walnut plugs, and I plugged each of those holes. I think that looks pretty sharp. And for those of you who have some epoxy laying around, I tinted some epoxy and put a little bit of that in each of those holes, and that really makes a very sharp, very clear, well-defined marker. So that's 3 different options, and it's pretty easy. So let's take the epoxy first off. So I've got a little bit of fast-acting epoxy here, and I used a touch of trans tint to darken it. These little monojets really make doing something like this simple. So all you have to do is just very carefully fill it to the sides. You don't have to fill it to the top flush. It's going to shrink in a little bit, but it goes pretty quickly and it's easy to do. So that's a very simple, fast way, and you don't have to use black either. There's all sorts of different colors. So very fast, very easy. Give it a couple hours to set, you're done. Now it's probably advisable that you do pre-finish your dominoes before you use any kind of epoxy, because sometimes the colorants can bleed into the wood a little bit. Now here's another option, which is the walnut plugs. So what I did was to use my CNC machine to cut a line of plugs just like I would on a drill press using a regular plug cutter. Only we use the CNC machine at an 1/8 inch bit. All you have to do is break them off. And I'm going to use another one of these little mono jets because I can be neat and tidy about it. And I'm going to put a small amount of glue. Now if you're planning on using the plugs, you might want to substitute the ball nose bit, instead using a just 1/8 inch end mill. And that way you'll get nice straight sides. But this will work fine. You may need to play a little bit with the final size. Get a perfect fit, and there's nothing more to it than that. I'll wait for the glue to set. I'll take this to my belt sander after I get all the other plugs in, flush everything off, you're good to go. And I think that's probably my favorite of the different options, is to use a plug. Now, I'll leave it to you if you want to try and match the grain orientation with each and every plug. I might have to think a little bit about that myself, or it might bother me every time I use them. So that's up to you. Once you've made your decision on whether you want to use the plugs or the epoxy, and you've done that, go ahead and finish your dominoes. I think an oil is the best option, probably about 3 coats each time. And I find that if you have access to compressed air, after you put the oil on and dry as much as you can with a rag, use a little compressed air and blow it out of these areas, and that'll keep it from dribbling out later on. So make sure they're well sealed, and with that, it's time to move on to making a box for our dominoes. Well, with the dominoes all finished, it's time to think about a box to put them in. Now, there's 100 ways to make a box, but I thought for this project, we'd go ahead and make a box out of 2 pieces of solid wood. Now, you can see on the machine, I've got an 1¼ inch piece of cherry here, and our first step is going to be to remove enough waste that we're going to create a cavity for all the dominoes. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and set up to make a profile cut to cut the outside shape of the box. So pretty simple. Solid wood boxes I think look good. You do need to choose stable wood because they can cup if you choose wood that has some stresses or a little extra moisture. Well, there's our bottom, ready to be cut out of its parent stock and cleaned up a little bit. So with that done, let's move on to the top. The top is pretty straightforward. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use a V-carving bit. So I'm going to take out my 1/4 inch and put in a 90-degree V-carving bit. And we're going to have a larger version of that same pattern we used on the dominoes, along with the word dominoes. When we're done with that, I'll flip the top over and we'll go ahead and cut a pocket to create a lip on the underside of the lid and then a profile, and that should take care of our box. Well, we finished up all the machining for the box and for the domino set inside. All that's left is to apply finish. So I'm going to use a drying oil, maybe about 2 coats on the box and on the dominoes. Now I've left a little room in here in the box, and that's so if you want to, you can line the box. Thin cork, felt, flocking, they'll all be great. Without any kind of a liner, it's going to rattle a little bit. So I think I'm probably going to go back and add the adhesive felt. It'll look great and it'll really protect the dominoes as well. The design that I've offered here, you can of course reproduce, but think of all the different things you can do. You could put your initials, maybe in the form of a monogram, your family name, the state you live in, all sorts of different options to customize them. And if you're giving it as a gift, customizing, people love it. So you might want to think about that. And of course you can also do something different with the lid to reflect what you've done with the dominoes. The dominoes themselves, we've talked about the options that you can use for the different numbers. I went ahead and chose to put wooden plugs in each of these holes. We also looked at using epoxy and just keeping the hole plain. It all looks great. I will tell you, using these plugs, that seems to be everybody's favorite here. And it wasn't that hard to do. As the machine was churning out another sheet of parts, I just worked away, plugging all the holes, and it wasn't bad. Didn't take too long at all. So a nice contrasting wood, it's a lovely accent. You might want to think about it. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I think it's a nice project. I think you'll like it. And I hope you'll join me again next month for another episode of CNC Basecamp. You know, a lot of CNC projects, you're done in an hour or two, no big deal. But there are some that are going to go on for hours and hours. In particular, carving. Sometimes it can take 2-3 hours to do the roughing pass, and then 7-10 hours, maybe even longer if you're a little bit OCD, to finish the final passes. So what happens if you need to pause? Let's say you need to go for lunch, you need to go to bed, you need to shut the machine down so the kids can sleep. What then? Well, what I usually end up doing is turning off the spindle or the router after hitting pause on the program, and then I'll leave the controller on, or the controller and my computer, depending on what machine I'm using. When I come back the next morning, well, I turn the spindle or the router back on, hit resume, and everything's fine. Well, I've had any number of times when it has not been fine, where I've come back and everything has crashed. And that's a real problem. You got 6, 7, 8 hours of carving work, an expensive piece of wood, and how do you restart? Everything's locked and frozen. Well, I found a couple of things to think about to help avoid that problem. One of them is, make sure the sleep settings on your computer are set to never let that thing go to sleep. And if you're using a separate screen, once again, check the sleep settings. It's kind of infuriating to have your machine go to sleep on you in the middle of the night. Also, we want to make sure that there's no updating that's going to take place that will cause the machine to automatically restart. So that's a simple thing you can do. Another thing is when you pause your program, your spindle and your router off, take a look at what the X, Y, and Z coordinates are on your screen. Write those down. That way, if you have to restart everything, you can. You're not going to move your spindle or router at all. You'll restart, and you're going to manually enter in the coordinates for your project just the way you left them. And by doing that, you can then get the machine back in tune to where it was supposed to be, in a relative sense, restart your spindle or router, hit resume, and you're good to go. You've saved yourself a lot of grief just by remembering to write the coordinates down before you left. Another thing you can do is use the homing setup on your machine. Not all machines are going to have homing switches. This one does. I'm going to access it through an app. And here we are, home X and Y axes. Open it. And the first thing I want to do is look at the offsets. So the homing switches will allow the machine to come into what's called the machine zero, a predetermined point at this corner, and we can always return exactly to that point. The offsets I'm going to choose, and that is going to place the machine back at a point where I actually want to begin my carving work. And so in this case, I've got an offset of 12 for my X and an offset of 12 for my Y. So let's go ahead and home the X-axis, and you can see the machine is going to just move into its furthest extent of travel. It's going to find this electrical switch. I'm going to accept, and now we are zeroed out with our X-axis. Now, with this machine, I need to be pretty close for the app to work correctly, so I'm going to go ahead and move a little closer into this corner, hit apps, home X and Y axes, press to open. We're going to home the Y axes. The machine is going to move. Accept the results. Now my screen is showing -12, -12. I'm going to go move to 0. And there we are. My screen says 0, 0. Now, by doing that, if we have a failure, what I can do is re-home the machine, let it find that machine home again, and then send it back with my same offsets, and we'll be back at the center point to restart our work again. Now, you may end up air cutting. You're going to lose a little time, but hey, you can recover, and it's a lot better than creating a very expensive firewood. So it's an easy way, by using those homing switches, to give yourself a little bit of insurance. Now, what if your machine doesn't have a homing switch system on it? Let's take a look at this one over here. What you can do is kind of fake it in a way. Right now, I've got the machine set at where I think I would like to have a 0, 0 point to begin a carving. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move the machine back into the corner, into what I consider 0, 0 territory for this machine. And what I'll do is simply using the control for the Z-axis and a 1/4 inch bit in my router, I can then drill a hole into the spoil board. And by doing so, I've created a physical reference point that I can come back to. If everything goes wrong, I can manually move my router back and manually center it over that hole. It takes a little fussing, it's not perfect, but generally you can slow the jog speed down to maybe a couple hundredths of its normal speed, and you can pretty much nail it. So to recap, check the sleep settings on your computer. That's very important. Next, make sure you always write down the coordinates before you leave the room. That gives you an option to recover. One thing I'm going to add to that, when you manually enter in the coordinates and your bit is still located on your workpiece, make sure that you manually raise it before restarting the program. Because what's going to happen if you don't, and I know this, is that the machine will take its shortest possible point to re-zero. And if something is in the way, like part of that carving or a clamp, $35 worth of bit is going to break, you're going to lose your zeroing, it's gone. So always make sure when you restart that the bit is well off your workpiece. And then of course we can use the homing switches on our machine, or we can create a home situation with a machine that does not have homing switches. So a little bit of time, a little bit of forethought will save you a lot of grief.